How do we know how the vowels were pronounced in Chaucer and Shakespeare's time? And the source for this section of the lecture comes from Charles Jones's History of English Phonology, and I've given you a link here in the web page to the relevant excerpt of the book if you want to follow up on this. So one place, and this already came up in the in the video on Shakespeare, that certain vowels were pronounced the same, and so certain words were pronounced the same, so they rhymed when they don't any longer. So on and one were homophonous, probably something like on and like a rounded back vowel. So, sir, your glove, not mine, my gloves are on. Why then, this may be yours, for this is what, but on again. So they would have been a perfect rhyme. We can also draw inferences about how English was pronounced at these times from the phonologies of modern varieties using standard practices of historical reconstruction. So given a difference between two languages, we can infer what the languages before must have looked like, given an understanding of how sound change happens, what direction changes from one sound to another typically go. But the most direct evidence that we have about how English was pronounced at this time comes from people living at that time, spelling reformers and phoneticians. So there'd be people who didn't like the spelling system because it didn't match their own pronunciation, or phoneticians so there were people who were already thinking about and phoneticians. There were people who were already thinking about the way that sounds were pronounced. So there's this comment by John Hart about the spelling in his day, that there's confusion and disordering. It's a dark kind of writing, and so we need to reform the spelling system. Of course, these ideas have continued, and there's this image again. This is all from Jones's book. There's this wonderful image of the mouth, and where in the mouth different sounds. This is a transcription system for the sounds, where in the mouth the tongue was placed. They didn't have MRI, but they could still, through introspection, get some idea where the tongues were. So we've kind of had an overview of the vowel shift. Now we're going to get into some more details. This table shows a chronology of the vowel shift. It was from a handout that Tony Kroc put on the internet that belonged to Don Ringe, I think, but it seems to have disappeared, and it's not even indexed by the Wayback Machine, so I don't have the handout for you. But this table's great because it shows you how different word types changed over time. And we'll start up in the left-hand corner here. So around 1400, the word bite would have been pronounced beta, and the word beat would have been pronounced bait. And so what changed was that the E sound diphthongized to I, so it's higher than the modern I. So here we have I, which eventually became I, and A rose up to E, bait to beat. We see a similar thing happening with abuta. So notice that both of these have final schwas that were lost historically. The oo became o, which eventually became ow. And then similarly, the word for boot was boat, which became boot. Now, one thing that's kind of interesting here is that the changes are mirrored in the words for the letters. So in French, B is pronounced B, so that's the A sound, which then became E. So it was borrowed from French as A, B, and then became B, whereas the French pronunciation stayed the same. Commenters at the time noticed that the spelling system wasn't working the way it should as the vowels were changing. And Hart notes the E is abused in two ways, right? The first is that it has a broad sound. So the broad sound, E having a broad sound, becomes I, contrary to all people but the Scots. So again, here we're seeing something that we see. This change is known from Scottish English, and some people have hypotheses that the Canadian raising that we'll be talking about in this section has a connection to Scottish English. Even though I have to tell you, I don't think that's true. But I'll leave that aside for now. um, so Hart also talks about the a sound, right? Properly, but in the word better and ever, but sometimes it's changed. So the word in words like we, notice the better stayed with it with a mid vowel, a lax mid vowel, whereas these words did shift in that. So in the word final position, they shift. Another bit of nice historical evidence about the changes of the vowel sounds is from the Hymn to the Virgin. It's written in English, but according to the conventions of Welsh, it was probably written by a Welshman. And so the interest of this is that there's a native Welsh speaker who's trying to represent the sounds of English using an orthography that was in between English and Welsh. And you can see that Christ is written in a way that shows the diphthongization. Same with crown and down. And we can see that in the 15th centuries, the 1400s, Christ was pronounced Christ, but by the time of the Welsh hymn, it was diphthongized, and that's what's being shown in the orthography of the Welsh hymn. Similarly, we're talking about how the mid vowels like A rose, and we, being spelled as it is now with the IPA mid front vowel, is spelled in the Welsh hymn with E. There are a couple more changes in the front vowel. So a long ah, a mid ah became A. So in a word like what was originally abata, it became A or maybe slightly diphthongized. And the long became A and then E. So words like beat started out as we saw up here. Beta was different from beat. This beat was, but then eventually it raised a little bit more slowly than the slightly higher or tense A, and they eventually merged to beat. But there are some words that didn't go all the way up. One example is the word break. The contrast, we're talking about the contrast between A and E, tense and lax mid vowels. The back tense lax contrast was preserved because the aw only rose up to O. There's controversy about the great vowel shift, not really about what happened, but why it happened. And the controversy is about whether it became it was a pull shift or a push shift. So a pull shift means, the question is really, what happened first up here? So did the E become I and pull the A up to E, or did A rise up towards E and push E to I? And here, the assumption in this chart from Melinda Menser is that, in fact, this was the first change and this was the second. And then it shows you the sequence of changes nicely in a way that's maybe a little easier to see than in the chart we saw. And then you see the last change is the one that took those diphthongs and brought them down to the ones that we have in standard English. Although there are varieties of English that have the raised vowel, and of course in Canadian raising we do have that raised vowel as well. So we're going to be listening to a dialogue written to illustrate the changes. These are from Mentor's site. There are two speakers, Cole and Alice. And in the mid parts of the change, Cole is a more conservative one, and Alice is a more advanced one. And this fits some things that we know about linguistics change. It's often led by women, and this comes up in the Labov lecture that you're going to be listening to in this section. So, as an exercise, I'm going to ask you to transcribe the vowels from this set of words. So we have name, speak, she, child, holy, soon, and loud in Middle English, kind of Chaucerian, and then also in Shakespearean English.